Hello everyone. Today I'm going to walk through the modeling of this jar of Marmite to produce an image similar to that which I found on the internet. It's just going to be a really quick run through this video. Overall the process took an hour. I'm going to try and condense that into about 20 minutes, including modeling and texturing, decals, lighting, etc. right at the end. But first, as you can see, I've just dropped in a couple of center lines, scaled them, and currently bringing in a sketch image so I can trace around some of the curvature of the jar. One important thing is to remember, obviously, when you take a picture, you have perspective, and you're trying to draw on a 2D plane. So you have to remember that you're not tracing the whole of the jar. You have to kind of use some judgment to imagine you're cutting through it in a 2D world. So I'm going to take the majority of the curves, which will be the basis of a revolve. That will be the kind of starting point for this model. Then later on I'll talk through quickly a spiral revolve, and then really that's probably the most complicated part of the model. The rest of it will be just simple cuts. So first step, the revolve, as said, that gives us the jar to start with, but it's not round. The real jar has some flat edges, so we have to add in those flat edges. My method for that was just quite simply a cut from the top plane. You can see here just using a couple of curves, which is going to be used to make these cutting tools. That's going to slice through the whole model. That gives us roughly the right kind of shape. So comparing it to the image, I can see that my new front face is a lot smaller than the real front face, so I need to extend where that sketch cuts the model. So I'm bringing those lines in to increase the width of that face, and I deem that's about right. Next, I'm looking at the bottom of the jar, and it's got a concave base. So to solve that one, it's simply just going to do a revolved cut of a sphere of that approximate diameter. Simple step: create the circle, turn it into a semicircle, then turn it into a sphere with a revolve and a revolved cut. Simple enough. Add a quick radius on there, and it's ready to be shelled. So measure the thickness of the glass to be 3 and shelled it to 3, and now we have a hollow jar, which is good for the visual because it has slight transparency. Obviously it's made of glass, quite dark glass. Next is to make the thread on the top, and I'm looking at the jar, noticing that the thread doesn't start right at the top, it starts a bit lower, so I made a plane just off the top surface, and I'm going to create my spiral or helix to go down to the base of the neck of the jar, counting the revolutions on the actual model to make it match, and you can see it runs to the neck. The next is to create the profile that you're going to drive along that curve. I'm not quite sure why I picked this method. I should have just drawn a triangle and rounded it, but it doesn't matter what's inside the wall. That's what I was talking about in that part of the video. So I've driven it round. I've noticed it's too thin. I'm going to make it bigger. So just a quick scale and move those sketch entities there. And that's better. It's not quite right. It needs to be a bit more blunt, and that's much better. And the reason those things are that way is because this is actually made in real life. The tolerance of glass is not that fine, so things are generally that not so small. All right, just blending in the end of the thread into the glass, checking how it looks. and notice that the end of the thread just kind of ends abruptly there, which is not how it is in real life. That should merge into that larger kind of bulge on the neck. So I just drove it around another half revolution till it merged in. Just going around now some of the edges and picking up some fillets so everything's smooth on glass. And then I noticed that there's a cut on the edge of the glass to make two flats on each side of the glass. I was speculating at this point, is that something to do with packaging, trying to get more into a package or preventing them smashing? Because rather than a point kind of hitting each other, flat edges spread out the pressure. So that's probably something they put on there to save breakages in transport. But I digress. Just threw in a couple of fillets there. And then on the bottom, if you'll notice, of a jar of Marmite, there's these like ridges, which I broke down to be essentially just some small cuts. That one was too big, so we just make it slightly smaller. And we do a circular pattern around that base to kind of give I didn't count each individual one, but that looks like closely matches what's on the actual physical model. And fillet in each one of those. For some reason that fillet selection always misses one, but I got it. I did miss that fillet though, so we'll go back in there and add that face in there. Perfect. Well, I think that's about it for the jar. So I think we can move on to the lid. Yeah, we're going to move on to the lid. So I'm just really quickly going to go through this, checking what size I need to make the lid. So I'm measuring the actual neck of the jar and giving myself those center lines as I do with every model. That's where I always start. I know the thickness of the lid of the material from measuring one, and it's a simple revolve starting position there. Now, the kind of most defining feature of the Marmite lid is this like ridge pattern along the top, which is like obviously gives you the grip, but it's quite defining. So the my method for that is to just do a simple revolve, but in degrees rather than go all the way around. You're just going to revolve this profile 2 degrees. About the center axis, which you'll see in a second. Just take down to 2, so it's just 1 notch. There you go. And then we're gonna checking the width, so I can add a fillet that matches the width, and then we're going to drive that round those 2 features, the fillet and the extrusion, to make the ridges, and that's quite close to real life. There's only a couple of small details on the lid after that, which is this circle and one that comes up to meet the grooves from the bottom. Now the lid in reality does have a few features on the inside, but for the purposes of the render I don't need those. So I'm going to leave that there, and we'll move. Yeah, of course, we're going to add just a few fillets, which is helpful in realistic renders because nothing really has a sharp edge in real life. And that's that part. We'll move on now to textures and materials now. So back to the jar, we're going to throw in this kind of dark brown glass straight from the textures library in Solidworks. Check how it looks. It's obviously way too light for a Marmite jar. When you look at one that's actually they're much darker. So this step is always going to be a bit more of an art, and using your judgment. So looking at the physical artifact and trying to match it up as closely as your eyes can with what your computer can tell you. So for this step, that's why I left it in integrated preview, so you can see what your changes, what effect your changes have. Quickly dropping in some decals for a label. I made these just by cropping them from a photo from the internet of a jar. Importantly, turning them into something with a transparent background, so you don't have any of the image that you don't want. So the black background has turned clear, for example. And I had to stretch this one to fit because the jar of Marmite that I stole the image from was a different size, so I had to do a bit of stretching. But it's quite unnoticeable in the end result, especially when given the warping of the glass itself kind of almost counteracted that warp anyway. So same process front and back, adding a decal, choosing those faces that it applies to, and it starts to already look quite believable. Just putting in a white scene helps with the lighting, helps you see things a bit better. So I generally work in just a plain white scene. Throwing these now into an assembly, and my first step is always to align the first part with the planes of the assembly, otherwise the product is just in a random space and it's really annoying. It's fixed there by default. Anyway, add the lid to where it goes, shunting it slightly up. Because I missed some of the features inside the lid, mine screws down too far, so I had to bring it up a bit. So again, working in a plain white scene, and we'll save out that assembly. So essentially the model is done for all intents and purposes, and we can check, and it looks believable already. And you can see the reflections in my environment show a scene of a kitchen by default. So I'm going to go in just, yeah, so again I'm just checking how mine looks, and I was doing this against the reference image off on another screen, and I'm just changing my lighting now to match. Yeah, here I'm talking about where the shadows lay and where my light's coming in, and changing the tone of the yellow. And again, just checking. So this part is a lot of backwards and forwards of change something, check it, change something, check it, and it's quite repetitive, but it's also quite fun because you know you're working towards something that's going to match this image. So here I'm looking at the reflections in this reference picture and noticing that the reflections in the glass are just simple panel lights. So it's obviously taken in like a photo booth. But we have those scenes built into Solidworks. So here you can see now that the squares match up. Those light panels match up. Kind of. There you go. So we get them back in. I think I was trying a couple of different environments to see what would happen. Yeah, I think we're happy with how those light reflections are on the glass. I'm trying to now make them pop a bit. So I'm trying to play around with how the light gets reflected from the scene, checking it against the reference image, and I'm not really liking where it's going because it's bringing up too much light on the base of the jars, too much scene reflection at this point. You can see that the bottom of that jar isn't nearly as light, it's quite dark. So another major thing is you notice that a light is coming from the kind of top right of the image down onto the lid, and it falls on that section there. So I'm adding a spotlight, and you can see now that that's much closer to the reference image. There I'm talking about, I'm not getting any kind of transparency through the neck as there is in the reference image. So I'm going here and tweaking the glass transparency just to see if I can get a bit of light to come through the glass. Playing around with the color of the glass, because this gives me the right effect in the neck, but then I'm getting it in the rest of the glass, which you don't get. Now, one thing I have learned from this is what I should have done is probably filled the jar with Marmite, with like a viscous black liquid, because then I would have still got the reflection through the neck without having to sacrifice. I kind of was shortcutting. I'll have just a darker glass, so I lose the transparency. But again, if I was to go back, that's what I'd do. That's what I'd do differently, I think. So setting up a camera now with the perspective in the right kind of place. Yep. I'm talking about the reflection that I could do that in Solidworks, or I could do that later on in Photoshop. As it happens, I did both. I did go back and do a render with a reflective floor, and I went back and did it a couple of different ways using Photoshop to enhance the image at the end. So that's the end of the first video. I hope that wasn't too much waffling. I hope there was something useful in there for you. Yeah, so check back, and I'll be putting more of these up as and when I get a chance.